She kissed the hanging man's boots, then turned and asked the sheriff, "You remember what he did to my sister?" The sun hung low over Redemption Creek like a wounded animal, bleeding orange and red across the dusty streets. Martha Whitmore stood beneath the gallows, her shadow long and thin against the packed earth. The rope creaked in the evening wind, and the boots at the end of it turned slowly, catching the dying light. Sheriff Tom Brennan watched from the courthouse steps, his star heavy as a stone against his chest. The weight of it seemed to grow with each passing minute, each slow turn of Billy Crenshaw's boots in the desert air. The boy had been dead 3 hours now, but the town still gathered in small groups, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes moving between the gallows and Martha like they were watching some strange dance between the living and the dead. Martha's weathered hands shook as she reached up toward those boots. The leather was scuffed and worn, boots that had walked too many hard miles in too few years. Billy Crenshaw had been 19 when the rope took him, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, but old enough to die for what he'd done to Sarah Whitmore, or what the town believed he'd done. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of sage across the square. It stirred Martha's gray hair around her face, and Brennan could see the lines there, carved deep by 3 years of grief and waiting. She had come to every day of Billy's trial, sitting in the back row with her hands folded in her lap, never speaking, never crying, just watching with those dark eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Now she stood beneath the gallows like she was praying to some terrible god. The crowd began to thin as the sun sank lower. Families called their children inside for supper. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps and pulled down their awnings. The business of dying was done, and life had to continue, the way it always did in towns like Redemption Creek. But Martha remained, and so did Brennan, both of them held by something stronger than duty or custom. The rope turned Billy's body toward the west, and his face caught the last rays of sunlight. Even in death, he looked young, too young for the thing that had brought him here. Brennan remembered the trial, remembered how Billy had stammered and wept when they read the charges. The boy had been drunk that night, drunk enough to confess to things that maybe he had done, maybe he hadn't. But the town had been hungry for justice, and Billy Crenshaw was the meal they'd been served. Martha stepped closer to the gallows. Her black dress rustled against her legs, and Brennan could hear the whisper of fabric even from where he stood. She was small, smaller than her sister had been, but she carried herself with a dignity that made her seem larger than the shadows growing around her. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun belt, not from any sense of danger, but from habit. 23 years wearing a badge had taught him that moments like this, quiet moments when the world seemed to hold its breath, were often the most dangerous. But Martha posed no threat to anyone except maybe the ghost that followed her through the streets of Redemption Creek. She raised her hands higher, her fingertips brushing the edge of Billy's boots. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, like she was blessing him or asking for forgiveness. The rope creaked louder in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the darkening sky. Then Martha did something that made Brennan's blood run cold in his veins. She kissed Billy Crenshaw's boots. Her lips pressed against the worn leather, and she held them there for a long moment while the wind died down and the world seemed to stop turning. When she pulled away, there were no tears on her face, no sign of the grief that Brennan knew must be eating her alive. Instead, there was something else, something that looked almost like peace. She turned then, her eyes finding Brennan across the square. The distance between them seemed to stretch like the desert itself, wide and empty and full of things that couldn't be taken back. Her voice, when it came, was steady and clear, cutting through the evening air like a blade through paper. "Sheriff Brennan," she said, and each word was weighted with purpose. "You remember what he did to my sister?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. It was not the question Brennan had expected, not the words that should have come from a woman who had just watched her sister's killer swing from a rope. There was something underneath her words, something that made his star feel heavier against his chest and his mouth go dry as alkali dust. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and old bones. Billy Crenshaw's body turned slowly in the wind, casting long shadows across the square, and Martha Whitmore stood waiting for an answer that Sheriff Tom Brennan was suddenly afraid to give. Behind him, the courthouse door creaked open, and Deputy Hayes stepped out, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden steps. "Sheriff?" he called, but Brennan didn't turn around. He couldn't take his eyes off Martha, couldn't shake the feeling that everything he thought he knew about justice and truth was about to crumble like a house built on sand. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere far off, somewhere beyond the desert and the mountains and the endless sky. It stirred the dust around Martha's feet and made the ropes sing a low, mournful song that seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. In that moment, standing beneath the gallows with the taste of leather still on her lips, Martha Whitmore looked like a woman who had kissed not just a dead man's boots, but the face of truth itself. And Sheriff Tom Brennan knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent too many years listening to confessions and last words, that the real reckoning was only just beginning. The question hung in the air between them like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Sheriff Tom Brennan felt the years roll back, 3 long years dissolving like morning mist under the desert sun. Martha's words echoed in his mind. "You remember what he did to my sister?" And suddenly he was standing in the Lucky Dollar Saloon again, staring down at Sarah Whitmore's broken body in the back room. It had been a cold October night, the kind that bit through a man's coat and settled in his bones. Brennan remembered the call coming just after midnight, old Pete the bartender hammering on the jailhouse door, with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Sheriff," he gasped, "you gotta come quick. It's Sarah Whitmore. Lord help us, she's dead." The walk to the saloon had seemed endless, each step echoing off the wooden sidewalks like gunshots in the night. The Lucky Dollar stood dark except for a single lamp burning in the back room, casting long shadows that danced on the walls like spirits of the damned. Sarah lay crumpled near the window, her yellow dress torn, her dark hair spread across the rough wooden floor like spilled ink. Brennan had seen death before, too much of it, but something about Sarah's stillness had cut him deeper than usual. She'd been barely 22, pretty in the quiet way that desert flowers were pretty, easy to overlook until you really saw them. Her eyes, so like Martha's, stared at nothing, and her hands were curled into small fists as if she'd fought until the very end. "Found her like this about an hour ago," Pete had whispered, wringing his hat in his hands. Door was locked from the inside, but the window was open. Whoever done this came and went that way. Now, standing beneath the gallows with Martha's eyes boring into his soul, Brennan could still smell that room, whiskey and sawdust and the copper scent of blood. He'd searched every inch of it, looking for clues, for answers, for something that would make sense of such senseless violence. But the room had given up few secrets that night. "I remember," he said finally, his voice rough as sandpaper. The words felt heavy on his tongue, weighted with doubt he'd buried for 3 years. Martha nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. "Tell me what you remember, Sheriff. Tell me what you think Billy Crenshaw did to my sister." The sun was almost gone now, painting the sky deep purple and gold. Billy's body swayed gently in the evening breeze, and the rope creaked its mournful song. Brennan found himself looking anywhere but at Martha's face, at those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Billy was drunk that night," he began, the words coming slowly, like water from a reluctant well. "Drunker than I'd ever seen him. Found him passed out behind the saloon around 2 in the morning, blood on his shirt, scratches on his face. When I woke him up, he started crying, started talking about what he'd done." "What exactly did he say?" Martha's voice was steady, but Brennan could hear something underneath it, something that made his chest tighten with unease. "He said he'd hurt her. Said he'd gone into the back room looking for more whiskey, and Sarah had tried to stop him. Said they'd fought, and—" Brennan's voice trailed off. Even now, 3 years later, he could see Billy's tear-streaked face, hear the boy's broken sobs as he confessed to killing the prettiest girl in Redemption Creek. "And the town wanted justice," Martha said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Brennan nodded. The trial had been swift, the verdict swifter. Billy Crenshaw was a drunk and a troublemaker. Everyone knew that. He'd been in and out of jail since he was 16, mostly for fighting and public drunkenness. When he confessed to murdering Sarah Whitmore, it had seemed like the natural end to a story everyone had seen coming. But Sarah never went into the Lucky Dollar's back room. Martha said, her words cutting through Brennan's memories like a knife. Not ever. She was afraid of small spaces, had been since she was a child. Couldn't even sleep in a room with the door closed. The sheriff felt something cold settle in his stomach, like swallowing ice water on a winter morning. What are you saying, Martha? I'm saying my sister wouldn't have been in that room willingly. Someone brought her there. Someone who knew she wouldn't fight as hard in a small space where she couldn't run. Martha's voice remained steady, but her hands were shaking now, just slightly. I'm saying Billy Crenshaw might have found her body, might have been so drunk he thought he'd done it himself, but he wasn't the one who killed her. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the square. Brennan watched them spin and collapse, feeling like his own certainty was doing the same thing. 3 years of believing he'd caught Sarah's killer. 3 years of sleeping soundly in his bed, knowing justice had been served. Now Martha's words were unraveling everything, pulling at threads he'd thought were tied tight. She tried to tell me. Martha continued, her voice growing softer. The night before she died, she came to see me. Said there was a man who'd been watching her, following her home from the general store. Said he made her skin crawl the way he looked at her. But I was busy. I was mending a dress for Mrs. Patterson, and I told Sarah she was being foolish. Told her to stop worrying about shadows. A tear rolled down Martha's cheek, the first sign of emotion she'd shown since kissing Billy's boots. She said his name, Sheriff. She told me who was watching her, who made her afraid to walk alone after dark. But I wasn't listening, not really. I was thinking about other things, selfish things. Brennan's mouth had gone dry as desert sand. What name, Martha? What name did she say? But Martha was looking past him now, past the courthouse and the empty streets, towards something only she could see. She had things, you know. Sarah was always hiding little treasures, little secrets. Even as a child, she'd tuck them away where no one could find them, under floorboards, behind loose stones and hollow trees. Martha! Brennan's voice was sharper now, edged with a desperation he didn't want to acknowledge. What name did Sarah say? She left me something, Martha whispered, as if she hadn't heard him. Something she wanted me to find if anything ever happened to her. Took me 3 years to work up the courage to look for it. 3 years of watching Billy Crenshaw swing from that rope in my dreams. The sheriff stepped closer, close enough to see the lines around Martha's eyes, the silver threads in her dark hair. What did she leave you? Martha reached in her dress pocket and pulled out something small and tarnished, something that caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them back like fragments of a broken mirror. It was a locket, old silver worn smooth by years of handling, hanging from a delicate chain. This was hidden under the floorboards in her room, Martha said, holding the locket up so it swayed gently in the evening air, along with a letter. A letter that tells a different story than the one Billy Crenshaw confessed to. The wind died suddenly, leaving the square in an eerie silence. Even a rope had stopped creaking, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Brennan stared at the locket, knowing with a certainty that made his bones ache that everything was about to change, that the truth he'd thought he knew was about to crumble like a sand castle in a flash flood. Martha's fingers worked at the locket's clasp, and it opened with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a photograph and a lock of dark hair tied with a ribbon. But it wasn't the hair that made Brennan's world tilt sideways. It was the photograph and the face staring back at him from the yellowed paper, a face he knew as well as his own reflection, a face that belonged to someone who still walked the streets of Redemption Creek with his reputation intact. Martha's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it might as well have been thunder for the way it shook the foundations of everything Brennan thought he knew about justice and truth. "Tell me, Sheriff," she said, her dark eyes meeting his across the gathering darkness. What do you know about a man who collects locks of hair from the women he kills? The walk to Martha's cabin felt like a funeral march. Sheriff Brennan followed her down the dusty path that led away from the town square, away from Billy Crenshaw's swaying body and the whispers of the gathering crowd. The sun had finally died behind the mountains, leaving the world painted in shades of gray and shadow. Martha's home sat at the edge of Redemption Creek, a small adobe structure with a wooden porch that sagged under the weight of too many desert storms. Sage brush grew wild around the foundation, and a single cottonwood tree stood guard beside the front door, its leaves rustling secrets in the evening breeze. Inside, the cabin held the particular stillness that comes to places where grief has taken up permanent residence. Candles flickered on rough wooden tables, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with photographs and memories. Brennan could see Sarah everywhere, in the faded daguerreotypes, in the extra chair by the fireplace, in the way Martha moved through the space like she was walking around invisible obstacles. "Sit," Martha said, gesturing to a chair that had seen better days. She moved to a small table near the window, where more candles burned beside a collection of items that made Brennan's chest tighten. Sarah's things, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in its bristles, a book of poetry with pages worn soft from reading, a blue ribbon that had once held back a young woman's hair. Martha lifted the locket again, holding it close to a candle flame so the light caught the tarnished silver. 3 years I've carried this weight, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 years of knowing the truth and not having the courage to speak it. What truth? Brennan asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Part of him wanted to walk out of this cabin and back to his comfortable certainties, back to a world where justice was simple and the guilty always got what they deserved. Martha opened the locket with trembling fingers. The photograph inside was small, no bigger than a silver dollar, but clear enough to stop Brennan's heart in his chest. The face looking back at him belonged to Judge Harold Whitman, the most respected man in Redemption Creek, the man who had sentenced Billy Crenshaw to hang. But it wasn't just seeing the judge's photograph that made Brennan's blood run cold. It was the way the picture had been taken, close, intimate, like a lover's portrait. And beside it, nestled against the faded velvet, was that lock of dark hair, Sarah's hair, tied with a piece of white ribbon. Judge Whitman, Brennan breathed, the name falling from his lips like a stone into still water. Martha nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The man who sentenced Billy to die for his own crime. The man who sat behind that bench and spoke of justice while Sarah's real killer walked free. The sheriff's hands shook as he reached for the locket, studying the photograph in the candlelight. Judge Whitman's face was younger in the picture, maybe 10 years younger, but it was unmistakably him. The same cold eyes, the same thin lips that had pronounced Billy's death sentence with such righteous authority. "Ow!" Brennan's voice cracked like a boy's. "How did Sarah?" "She worked for his wife sometimes," Martha explained, sinking into the chair across from him. "Cleaning, mending, helping with the garden. Mrs. Whitman was kind to her, paid her well. But the judge..." Martha's voice trailed off, and she stared into the candle flame like she was seeing the past there. Sarah said he watched her, said he found excuses to be alone with her, to brush against her when she was working. Said his hands lingered too long when he helped her carry things. Brennan felt sick, like he'd swallowed poison. Why didn't she tell anyone? Why didn't she come to me? Martha's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Tell who, Sheriff? Tell you? Tell the mayor? Tell the preacher?" Judge Whitman owned this town, owned everyone in it. Who would have believed a poor girl's word against his? The sheriff knew she was right, knew it with a certainty that made his badge feel like a millstone around his neck. Judge Whitman had been in Redemption Creek for 15 years, had built his reputation on fair dealing and moral authority. He'd married Margaret Olson, the banker's daughter, and settled into respectability like it was a suit of clothes tailored just for him. "The letter," Brennan said. "You mention a letter." Martha reached beneath the pile of Sarah's belongings and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases. "She wrote it the day before she died. Left it with the locket, hidden under her floorboards where she knew I'd eventually find it. She handed the letter to Brennan, and he unfolded it with the care of a man handling dynamite. Sarah's handwriting was neat and careful, the letters formed with the precision of someone who'd learned to write later in life and valued each word. My dear Martha, the letter began, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and I pray God it was not what I fear it might be. Brennan's eyes moved over the words, each one hitting him like a physical blow. Sarah wrote about Judge Whitman's advances, about how he'd cornered her in his study one afternoon and forced himself on her while his wife was visiting her sister in the next town. She wrote about the photograph he'd insisted on taking afterward, and the lock of hair he'd cut from her head like some kind of trophy. He said no one would believe me if I told, Sarah had written. He said I was just a poor girl with a reputation for being too friendly with men, and he was a respected judge with a position in the community. He said if I caused trouble, he would make sure everyone knew what kind of woman I really was. The letter went on, describing how Judge Whitman had continued to pursue Sarah, how he'd threatened her livelihood and her sister's reputation if she didn't submit to his desires. How he'd grown angry when she'd finally found the courage to refuse him, angry enough to make threats that had terrified her into hiding. I know this will hurt you to read, the letter concluded, but if something happens to me, if I'm found dead or missing, please know that Judge Whitman is not the man this town believes him to be. The locket will prove what I say is true. I love you, dear sister, and I'm sorry for bringing this darkness into our lives. Brennan's hands shook as he folded the letter. The candles flickered in a sudden draft, sending shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and making the old cabin creak and sigh. Billy found her, Martha said quietly. Poor, drunk Billy stumbled into that back room and found my sister's body. Judge Whitman had probably been long gone by then, but Billy was so drunk, so confused, he thought he might have done it himself. The scratches on his face weren't from fighting with Sarah. They were from stumbling through the brush behind the saloon, trying to find somewhere to be sick. The sheriff closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what Martha was telling him. An innocent man had died, and a guilty one had not only walked free, but had been the one to sentence that innocent man to death. The very foundation of justice in Redemption Creek was built on a lie, and he, Sheriff Tom Brennan, had been the one to arrest Billy Crenshaw, to present the evidence that had condemned him. Why now, he asked. Why tell me this now, after Billy's already dead? Martha wiped her eyes with a corner of her shawl. Because I couldn't live with it anymore. Because every night I hear that rope creaking, see Billy's face when they put the noose around his neck. Because my sister deserves better than to have her killer sitting in judgment of others, deciding who lives and who dies. She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense in the candlelight. And because Judge Whitman is still out there, sheriff, still watching women, still taking what he wants. Mrs. Patterson's daughter has been asking to walk her to church lately, says she doesn't like being alone on the streets. And young Mary from the bakery mentioned that someone's been following her home after work. The words hit Brennan like bullets. The judge was still hunting, still taking what he pleased from women who had no power to stop him. How many others had there been? How many victims had suffered in silence while the town praised Judge Whitman's moral character? What do we do? Brennan asked, though he already knew the answer would tear his world apart. Martha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness that had swallowed Redemption Creek. In the distance, they could still see the outline of the gallows, could still make out Billy Crenshaw's body swaying gently in the night breeze. We do what should have been done 3 years ago, she said, her voice steady as stone. We tell the truth. We make sure my sister's real killer faces justice, even if it destroys everything this town believes about itself. She turned back to Brennan, and in the candlelight, she looked like an avenging angel, terrible and beautiful and absolutely certain. The question is, Sheriff, do you have the courage to help me? Do you have the strength to admit that the justice you've been serving is nothing but a lie wrapped in a badge? Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and the wind carried the sound across the desert like a warning. Brennan stared at the locket in his hands, at the photograph of Judge Whitman's face and felt the last of his certainties crumble away like sand castles in a flood. In the morning, he would have to decide whether to serve the truth or protect the lie that held Redemption Creek together. And God help him, he already knew which choice would cost him everything he'd ever believed about justice, honor, and the weight of wearing a star. Dawn came to Redemption Creek like a reluctant witness, painting the sky pale gold and casting long shadows across the dusty streets. Sheriff Tom Brennan stood on his office porch, watching the town wake up to what might be its last day of comfortable lies. In his hand, he held the silver locket that would change everything, its weight heavier than any gun he'd ever carried. Martha approached from the direction of her cabin, walking with the steady purpose of a woman who had finally found her courage. She wore the same black dress from the night before, but something about her seemed different in the morning light. Straighter, stronger, like a tree that had weathered the worst storm and discovered it was still rooted deep. "You ready for this?" she asked, though her eyes already knew the answer. Brennan nodded, tucking the locket into his vest pocket where it rested against his heart like a second conscience. "Judge Whitman will be in his chambers by now, preparing for court. Best we face him there, where the whole thing started." They walked together through the awakening town, past shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps and children running to school with lunch pails swinging from their hands. Nobody paid them much attention, just the sheriff and the grieving woman, walking like old friends toward whatever business waited at the courthouse. They couldn't know they were watching the last morning of innocence Redemption Creek would ever see. The courthouse stood solid and imposing in the growing light, its stone walls built to last centuries, to outlive the small human dramas that played out within its chambers. Judge Whitman's office occupied the second floor, behind a door marked with gold lettering that proclaimed him a pillar of justice and moral authority. Brennan knocked twice, his knuckles rapping against the wood like a death knell. "Come in," came the familiar voice from within, cultured and confident, the voice of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Judge Harold Whitman sat behind his massive oak desk, reviewing papers in the morning light that streamed through tall windows. He was a handsome man still, despite his 50-odd years, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded respect. When he looked up and saw Martha, his face remained composed, but Brennan caught something flickering in his eyes, a shadow of recognition, of old fear. "Sheriff Brennan," the judge said, setting down his papers with practiced calm. "Mrs. Whitmore, how may I help you this morning?" Martha stepped forward, her hands folded in front of her like she was approaching an altar. "Judge Whitman," she said, her voice steady as bedrock, "I've come to talk about my sister." "A tragic case," the judge replied, though his fingers had gone still on his desk. "Billy Crenshaw paid the price for his crime. Justice was served." "Was it?" Martha asked, and the two words fell into the room like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of unease through the morning air. Brennan watched the judge's face, saw the careful mask of authority begin to crack around the edges. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mrs. Whitmore, but if you have concerns about the trial, I assure you I have this," Martha interrupted, pulling Sarah's letter from her pocket. The paper rustled in the silence, and Judge Whitman's eyes fixed on it like a snake watching a mouse. "A letter my sister wrote the day before she died. Would you like me to read it to you, Judge, or would you prefer to tell us the truth yourself?" The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Outside, the town was going about its morning business, unaware that the foundation of their trust was cracking apart in this quiet room. Judge Whitman's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of water on his desk, and Brennan saw in that small gesture the collapse of 15 years of carefully constructed respectability. "I don't know what lies that girl wrote," the judge said, but his voice had lost its authority, had become the voice of a cornered animal. Sarah Whitmore was disturbed. Everyone knew that. She made up stories, tried to cause trouble. "Like this story?" Brennan asked, pulling out the locket and setting it on the desk between them. The silver caught the morning light and threw it back like accusation made solid. Judge Whitman stared at the locket as if it were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. His face had gone pale as courthouse paper, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Where did you get that?" "Sarah hid it under her floorboards," Martha said quietly, "along with the letter that tells how you forced yourself on her, how you threatened her, how you cut her hair like some kind of trophy. The letter that tells how you killed her when she finally found the courage to say no." The judge's careful composure shattered like glass. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking like a boy's. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I never meant for her to die. She was going to ruin everything, going to destroy my reputation, my marriage, my position in this community. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand. Understand what?" Martha's voice cut through his excuses like a blade. "Understand that powerful men can take whatever they want from women with no one to protect them? Understand that your desires were more important than her life." Judge Whitman buried his face in his hands, and when he spoke, his words came muffled and broken. Billy Crenshaw was going to hang anyway. Everyone knew he was no good, knew he'd end up at the end of a rope sooner or later. When he confessed, it seemed like Providence. Like God was giving me a way out. God. Martha's voice rose for the first time, carrying 3 years of suppressed rage and grief. "You think God wanted an innocent boy to die for your sins? You think the Almighty was helping you cover up murder?" Brennan felt sick, listening to the judge's confession, understanding finally how justice had been perverted in Redemption Creek. A young man had died not for what he'd done, but to protect a pillar of the community who had committed the very crime he'd judged others for. "What happens now?" Judge Whitman asked, looking up at them with eyes that had aged a decade in the past 10 minutes. "Now you resign," Brennan said, his voice hard as iron. "You write a confession, a full confession admitting what you did to Sarah and acknowledging Billy's innocence. Then you leave Redemption Creek and never come back. And if I refuse?" Martha leaned forward, her dark eyes boring into the judge's soul. "Then I read Sarah's letter at Sunday service. Then I show her locket to every person in this town. Then I make sure everyone knows that the man they've been trusting with their lives and their justice is nothing but a murderer who let an innocent boy hang for his crimes." Judge Whitman nodded slowly, like a man accepting his own death sentence. His hands shook as he reached for pen and paper, shook as he began to write the words that would destroy everything he'd built in Redemption Creek. Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting the town in gold and shadow. Soon the streets would fill with people going about their daily business, unaware that their world had just shifted on its foundations. Soon there would be questions, outrage, demands for explanations that no one could give. But for now, in this quiet room, there was only the scratch of pen on paper and the sound of a man's reputation dying one word at a time. When the confession was finished, Judge Whitman set down his pen and looked at Martha with something that might have been gratitude in his eyes. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day for 3 years." Martha studied his face for a long moment, then shook her head. "Sorry doesn't bring back my sister, Judge. Sorry doesn't give Billy Crenshaw another chance at life. Sorry is just something you tell yourself to make the guilt easier to carry." She turned and walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "But it's a start," she said without looking back. "It's more than Sarah ever got from you." 3 hours later, Martha Whitmore knelt beside Billy Crenshaw's grave in the small cemetery at the edge of town. The wooden marker was simple, carved with nothing but his name and the years of his short life. Someone had already planted wildflowers around the base, Indian paintbrush and desert lupin that would bloom bright and wild in the spring. She added her own flowers to the collection, desert marigolds she'd picked on the walk from town. As she arranged them around the marker, she spoke quietly to the boy whose death had weighed on her conscience for 3 years. "It's done, Billy," she whispered to the desert wind. "Everyone knows the truth now. Everyone knows you were innocent." Behind her, she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Sheriff Tom Brennan approached slowly, his badge no longer pinned to his vest. He'd resigned that morning, right after Judge Whitman had read his confession to a stunned courtroom full of townspeople who could barely believe what they were hearing. "The stage left an hour ago," he said, settling down beside Martha on the sun-warmed earth. Judge Whitman was on it, heading east. Don't expect we'll ever see him again. Martha nodded, still arranging flowers around Billy's grave. Good. Let him carry his shame somewhere else. Let some other place deal with his ghosts. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb toward its peak in the endless desert sky. Around them, the cemetery held the quiet of centuries, the patient peace of those who had finished their earthly struggles and found rest in the deep earth. What will you do now? Brennan asked eventually. Martha considered the question, her fingers gentle on the desert marigolds. I think I'll stay here for a while longer. This town needs time to heal, and maybe I can help with that. Maybe I can make sure other women don't have to face what Sarah faced alone. She looked at him then, her dark eyes soft with something that might have been forgiveness. What about you, Tom? Where does a man go when he spent 23 years wearing a badge for all the wrong reasons? Brennan smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Martha had seen from him since this whole thing began. West, I think. Maybe California, maybe Oregon. Somewhere I can start fresh, maybe learn to live with my mistakes instead of just carrying them around like stones in my pockets. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain from somewhere beyond the mountains. It stirred the wildflowers around Billy's grave and made them dance like they were celebrating something. Maybe justice finally served. Maybe peace finally found. Maybe just the simple fact that truth, however painful, was better than the prettiest lie. As the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward evening, Martha Whitmore and Tom Brennan sat beside Billy Crenshaw's grave and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like they could carry their ghosts with dignity instead of shame.